to refer back to it later. Let's see, here's Rosamund, and then we'll start.
Oh, good.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to a meeting of Progressive Legacy. Our guest tonight is Maryland State Delegate Vaughn Stewart, a delegate from District 19. Vaughn was born in Alabama, went to school at the University of Pennsylvania and to New York Law School. He's clerked at the federal level. He's worked in a law firm. And as you know, he is our District 19, one of our District 19 delegates. Vaughn serves on the Board of Directors of Action Committee for Transit, the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. He's a treasurer, I believe, of the District 19 Democratic Club. And he, with me, was a delegate to the 2020 Democratic National Convention. So we welcome Vaughn, and we've asked him to discuss some of the issues of interest to us that are before the Maryland General Assembly in 2021. So with that brief introduction, thank you, Vaughn, and take it away.
Sure. Thank you very much, Alan. I really appreciate the invitation. I have not spoken to this group since the BC times before coronavirus. It's been 2 or 3 years, and obviously this is a completely different format. I hope that everyone is doing well and staying safe and staying healthy. As Alan mentioned, my name is Vaughn Stewart. I represent District 19. For those of you who may not live in District 19, though it looks like almost everyone does, the district includes Leisure World, Aspen Hill, Durwood. It goes all the way down to North Four Corners, north of downtown Silver Spring. I was elected in 2018, so this is my 3rd session in the Maryland General Assembly, my 2nd full year. And I serve in the House of Delegates, and I also serve on the Environment and Transportation Committee, which includes those 2 issues and also has jurisdiction over housing issues and ethics issues. So in general, my priorities and sort of my areas of focus tend to be in those 4 areas: environment, transportation, housing, and ethics, though I delve, in other areas as well. So yeah, I thought I would give kind of a brief overview of sort of the hot topics in the General Assembly, and I'll highlight as we go along where I'm involved on a personal level. And then I want to be as brief as possible because I want to open it up for questions. I know that I want to have you all guide the direction rather than me just ramble on. So I think that this is obviously one of the most unusual sessions. It'll probably go down in history as the most unusual session in the history of the General Assembly. Last year we had a shortened session. It was the first session that had been shortened since the Civil War due to COVID. And now we have an almost fully virtual session where I sit in this room every day, all day, in virtual committee hearings. We are actually starting an in-person component for floor sessions next week, but that'll be the first time that we've been required to come to the floor for any reason. So that'll be interesting. And they've made all sorts of safety protocols and spread us out across the campus, and there's a mask mandate and on and on. But the big issues that are coming to us, a lot of them revolve around what's happened, the big hot topics of what happened in 2020, namely racial justice and sort of the awakening around police reform and policing and the carceral state. And then secondly, COVID, not only the pandemic in terms of the health ramifications, but the economic ramifications. As I'm sure you all know, this is what the nerdy, economists call a K-shaped recovery, and that those that were already doing pretty well before COVID are still doing pretty well. And in some cases, they're actually doing better. And those who were hurting before COVID had disproportionately borne the brunt of the economic trauma and pain, and they're doing worse than ever before. And so, the General Assembly, I think, is principally committed to those 2 issues right there, which is number 1, looking at how our criminal justice system has been established and how it's working and how it's not working, looking at how our police institutions across the state are set up and what guidelines are in place for them and what discipline looks like when cops do the wrong thing, and also what information is available publicly for the Maryland Public Information Act. What kind of public information is available about discipline that police officers have received? So there's a transparency component, a standards component. There's a there's an accountability component to make sure that police officers who harm people or hurt people, kill people, maim people, and they are not in the right when they do that, to make sure they're held accountable. So that's a huge component. And I think undergirding that is also just an awareness that issues regarding racial inequities and the fact that communities of color have been left behind are a lot more systemic than just talking about police. So certainly, there will be a heavy focus on police accountability and legislation transparency, but this is a much larger issue. And so Speaker Jones, who is not only the first Black speaker, but the first woman speaker, has unleashed what she's calling the Black agenda. But she basically has a sort of full panoply of a racial justice agenda, including something that actually is going to be quite transformative, which is that for the first time, for some pieces of legislation, there will actually be a racial equity analysis. There's currently like a small business analysis, a fiscal analysis, but for the first time, there will be actually a racial equity analysis of certain legislation when it's drafted. And her bill, legislation goes much further than that, or her package goes much further. It discusses, representation of minorities and women on corporate boards. It talks about procurement and basically like state contract opportunities for minority-owned, women-owned, and veteran-owned businesses and small businesses. And I think her general idea and thesis behind this is that when communities of color, when working class people, when low income people benefit, when they're brought up, everyone benefits, and that a rising tide lifts all boats. And as I think the former senator from Minnesota, Paul Wellstone, would say, we all do better when we all do better. And so I think that's certainly a big focus on the racial justice front, which is that not only policing, but also sort of the economic elements of racial justice. And then we're going to be talking a lot about COVID. And that extends to the health arena in terms of telework, telehealth, and making sure that all of our, legislative, work is up to date with what's happening and sort of the revolution that the medical community has had to undergo. But then the other piece of that is relief, COVID relief. So right now there are talks between the governor and the House and the Senate around what a relief package will look like. Whether that will be stimulus checks, whether that will be, who will get them. It'll include, businesses, relief for small businesses, and a number of other things. So those are kind of the big hot topics. But I thought I would go through a few other sort of smaller pieces that are still going to be important in this session, and also just sort of highlight the role I'm playing with them. So first, the big news today was that the Speaker and the Senate President announced a big package of unemployment insurance reform. I don't know how many of y'all are aware, but the unemployment insurance system in Maryland has been a disaster. We have been several months the slowest state in the country to send out benefits. And the federal guidelines say that something like 90% of people eligible for unemployment insurance should be paid within a couple weeks. And the national average during the pandemic, instead of being 88% or whatever, it's more like 55% national average. We're 20%. So less than a quarter of Marylanders are getting their check in anything resembling a timely fashion, which is just absolutely unacceptable. And so the legislative leaders announced a big package of UI-related bills, simple things too, like making sure people can get paper checks instead of just through a debit card, making sure that there's a caller ID when the unemployment insurance office calls you so you know who's calling, making sure that everyone can always leave a callback number so that they're not just like helpless waiting for a call that may never come, staffing up the agency so they just have enough bodies there to answer the phone. Just basic good government things. Because I mean, at the end of the day, like, we as progressives, or we as progressive Democrats, we believe that government can do good things. We fundamentally believe that government, when activated, can be an efficient, productive force for good. And so therefore it's incumbent on us to make sure that government works well, because when it doesn't, when it's inefficient and it's slow, it's clunky, as it was for the UI system, which continues to be for the UI system, and what it is honestly right now with the vaccine rollout, where Maryland also ranks at the bottom. Both of these things have been huge failures for the Hogan administration, but more fundamentally, I think they've diminished public trust in government, which is Not a problem for Governor Hogan's party, because his party has always said that government can't do anything right. But it is a problem for my party, for our party, because I think our entire ideology hinges on the idea that government can do well, can do good and do well. So that's why I think this UI package is important, making sure that people regain trust in their government. They can do something as basic as writing checks or sticking needles in your arm, which I'll get to in a minute. Next point is housing. Obviously the fallout from the economic crisis has been, everyone's been telling folks you're safer at home, but the big assumption that underlies that is that you've got a home. And a lot of folks increasingly have not had homes during the pandemic, or were at risk of eviction or at risk for foreclosure. And so one of the other big topics that the legislature will be taking up, and this is the one where I'm most active on, I've sort of spearheaded what we're calling a housing justice package, which includes 5 separate bills that tackle different elements of the housing crisis. And to be clear, the housing crisis was already something that was acutely felt in Maryland long before anyone had ever heard of the coronavirus. The pandemic has merely exacerbated a pre-existing problem for a lot of Marylanders. And so the package does a lot of things, but it, for example, extends the moratorium on evictions, on foreclosures. It bans things like late fees and adverse credit reporting. It makes it harder for landlords to just decline to renew someone's lease, because that actually tends to be sort of the backdoor way that they're getting around these eviction moratoria. Oh, we won't evict you. We just won't renew your lease. And I have a bill actually on that issue, which is that right now in Maryland statewide, tenants only get 1 month notice before the landlord is declining to renew their lease. Because so someone could be renting their home out for 30 years. And then with just 30 days notice, they could have to move. They haven't looked for an apartment in years and years and years. And all of a sudden they're on the street. So my bill would extend that to 6 months notice, 60 days, 2 months notice, if you've lived in your apartment for less than 2 years. But if you're a long-term tenant, if you live in your home for more than 2 years, you would get 3 months notice, 90 days, which is, not radical, but just sort of like, is the sentiment is, if you're going to be booted, if you're going to be homeless, you should at least get a little bit of fair warning before that happens, at the very least. That bill actually is going to end up in the Speaker's housing package, which is good news. We just learned that yesterday, actually. So that bill will pass with the Speaker's imprimatur. I have another tenant bill called the Tenant Protection Act, which does a number of things, mostly involving just kind of empowering tenants across a broad range of things. So for example, it requires landlords to show receipts when they take your security deposit. So if they're going to take your security and say, oh, I've got to do these repairs, they got to actually show you what they spend the money on. They can't just say, oh, I needed $500, so I took the whole thing. Number 2, it allows tenants to use community rooms in the building for purposes of tenant organizing. So if they want to create a tenants association and band with their neighbors to stand up for their rights, they get free access to any meeting rooms in the building once a month, which is, again, very reasonable. The next thing it does, it relates to victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, and stalking. So right now, number 1, victims of stalking do not have the right to break their lease early. Victims of sexual assault and domestic violence do. If you're a victim of sexual assault and domestic violence already, or domestic violence already in Maryland, you can legally break your lease early to leave that dangerous situation. But that does not extend to stalking victims. Stalking, unfortunately, is a crime on the rise, maybe because of the rise of social media or whatever. Stalking is on the rise, and so the bill extends that protection. And then most crucially, right now in Maryland, the only way you can prove that you're a victim of any of those things and therefore break your lease early is through a court order or by getting a police officer to attest to it. But a lot of folks don't feel comfortable in either setting. If you have an abusive spouse, you may not feel comfortable going to a police officer, especially if your husband is a police officer, or going to the court system. So what this bill, the Tenant Protection Act, would do as well is provide that a social worker, a therapist, a psychologist can, as long as you're sort of like a professional, a registered professional, you can attest that someone's a victim of those things for purposes of early lease termination. So that also is in the Speaker's housing package, so that will also pass, which is great. And then I have a third bill that relates to homeowners, because I think a lot of times when we talk about housing inequity, we talk only about renters, but a lot of homeowners, especially during this pandemic, have been struggling as well to keep up their mortgage payments. And so I basically have like kind of the homeowner, like the major kind of foreclosure bill of the session called the Homeowner Relief Act. And it would do a number of things, but I think most importantly, it would make it so that if once you're coming off forbearance, because there was generous forbearance offered by the federal government during the pandemic for people who couldn't pay their mortgage payments, but that ends in the spring. And so the main thing the bill does is create an easy path to repayment, and it prevents mortgage servicers, it prevents the bank from forcing homeowners to pay like a lump sum altogether. Because I mean, you know, you take someone who they lost their job in April of 2020, they had to do forbearance for a year. They're not going to have 12 months of mortgage payments ready to go when their forbearance ends. They're just not. I mean, that's impossible, especially, you know, if you lost your, even if you didn't lose your job, that's never going to happen. So the bill would say that you can't do a lump sum, and the default option would be tacking the missed payments to the end of the loan. So if you had a 30-year mortgage and you got 20 years left and you had 1 year of forbearance, congratulations, you now have a 21-year mortgage left, and you don't have to worry about those missed payments for 2 decades. And that is the most consumer-friendly option, and so that would be the default option. So that bill does a number of things. So that's sort of the housing piece. In the sort of COVID arena of protections and relief, other than just sort of direct stimulus payments, the other thing is just making sure workers have protections in the workplace, making sure that, you know, PPE is required, distancing is required. I have a bill along those lines called the Healthy Farm Workers Act, which actually focuses specifically on agricultural workers, mostly on the Eastern Shore, mostly in the poultry industry. As many of y'all probably know, this has been kind of the big ag and factory farms has turned into an issue for me, just because the reality is that these major poultry producers on the shore have not been taking care of the bay, and they do not take care of their workers. There was actually an Oxfam report in 2016 that revealed that some of the poultry companies, including those that operate on our Eastern Shore, they were not providing bathroom breaks to their workers, such that their workers on the line making our food were having to wear diapers while they process the chicken that we eat. Yeah. And so, I mean, the reality is, you know, cheap chicken is sort of on the backs of not only the exploited workforce, but also the Chesapeake Bay, which has been absolutely brutalized by manure runoff from the chicken industry. So the farm workers bill is pretty simple. It basically say that farm workers have the right to habitable housing. So it doesn't even touch the workforce component, because the housing component is actually even more unjust than what happens in the workforce. The poultry industry generally provides employer provided housing, which are basically like glorified checks. They stick like 12, sometimes undocumented, sometimes immigrants on a visa, 12 of them in a 1-bedroom apartment. And then they pick them up on the bus every morning to go to the factory to make the chickens. And so obviously this is unjust in any society. It's morally repugnant to have the people making our food live in, you know, shoddy conditions just in general. But it's an especially nightmare situation when our food supply chain during a pandemic relies on these people staying healthy, and yet they're sharing bathrooms, they're sharing bedrooms, they're sharing kitchens in these tiny, tiny little dilapidated, you know, shacks that they just kind of put up on a temporary basis. So the bill basically does a number of things to make sure these homes are inspected, to make sure that they're habitable, make sure there's adequate ventilation, et cetera. One of the other big things is we've got to pay for all this, right? So we've had a budget crunch. Our budget looks like it's in a little bit better shape than we thought months and months ago, but there's still a big debate in Annapolis right now, including within the Democratic Party. This isn't necessarily a Democrat versus Republican thing. It's a Democrat versus Democrat thing, which is how do we fully fund education, balance our budget, and provide all this pandemic relief to people who are hurting? How do we do all those things? You know, we're not the federal government. We have to balance our books every year. We can't deficit spend. So how do we do that? Well, I'm strongly of the view that we should not be balancing the budget or paying these relief checks on the backs of the people who have been most hurt by the pandemic. You know, we should not be asking essential workers and the vulnerable and, you know, folks, you know, with low incomes, working class people to be paying more in taxes so we can make this work. I think the people who have been profiting from the pandemic and who are just fine, which is the wealthiest few and the largest corporations, they should be paying their fair share so that we can balance the budget. A lot of large corporations in Maryland, including companies like Marriott and Under Armour, generally don't pay any taxes in Maryland. There's so many corporate tax loopholes up and up and up, and their lawyers are so good that almost everybody, everybody in this room pays more in taxes, whether it's sales, whether it's retirement, income tax, whether it's payroll, whatever, property tax. Everybody here pays more in taxes than the largest corporations do in Maryland every year. And sometimes that's nationwide. Amazon generally doesn't pay any taxes federally either. And so I have a bill called the throwback rule, which would close one of the most egregious corporate tax loopholes in the code, and it would generate $50 million a year. And I actually introduced it last year too, and it passed. It passed the House. It was the first time. Years and years, folks have been trying to put it in before I got there, and we finally got it through the House, but we couldn't get it through the Senate last year in time. So I'm reintroducing that. It's called the throwback rule. It has nothing to do with fishing or throwback jerseys or anything. Basically, the concept is that there's a concept called nowhere income. This gets a little bit wonky, so try to stay with me. But basically, if you are a large multi-state corporation, you cannot be taxed in a state where you don't have facilities. That's federal law. So if you don't have a facility, a building, something in a state, you can't be taxed there. And so what happens is, let's say I'm a Maryland-based company, and all I do is manufacture University of North Carolina Tar Heel apparel. And I'm this big company, and I ship all over the country, mostly North Carolina, but I do a lot of business, all this college sports stuff. Well, I don't have any facilities in all these different, different states that are buying these t-shirts from me. Therefore, they can't tax me there. That's nowhere income. It's lost. I'm generating all these profits, but since I'm located in Maryland, Maryland's not seeing any of that. And so what the throwback rule says is that if you got any nowhere income that's not taxed anywhere else, that those profits are thrown back in the name into Maryland and taxed here, which is only fair, because if you're a mom and pop business located in College Park selling only, I may have cut out. Can y'all still hear me? I think my connection is somewhat unstable. We still good? Okay. So basically, this bill would not only generate revenue, but it would level the playing field for small businesses. Because if you're a College Park-based business selling Terp memorabilia, you're going to be paying taxes on 100% of your profits. But if you're a huge, big mega corporation shipping all over the country, you're not. So that bill is part of what's called the fair funding package of bills that basically ask the largest corporations and the wealthiest few to pay for our recovery, not working class people who have been hit by the pandemic. And then I'm just going to cover a couple more topics, and I'm going to shift it over to questions. So I know we're reaching the halfway mark here. So the environment is a big issue for me. I'm on the environmental committee. I'm one of those sort of leading legislators on issues about climate and the Chesapeake Bay. I have two bills this session on basically clean water, which is an important issue. I mean, I know a lot of y'all know, I won't go into the full story, but I'm a 2-time cancer survivor. In all likelihood, because Monsanto used my hometown in Alabama as a dumping ground for PCBs. And so they didn't tell the workers, they didn't tell the community, but they were dumping these toxins into the air, into the water. And so no town in America or in the world has ever had a higher level of PCB contamination ever recorded than my hometown in Alabama. And therefore the cancer rates are sky high. And the cancer that I had in 2017, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, is the cancer that's associated with PCB exposure. So I can't prove it, but in all likelihood, Monsanto gave me cancer. And so these issues about sort of human health and water quality and air quality on the one hand are often juxtaposed against corporate profits on the other hand in Annapolis. We always have bills where it's like, oh, well, should we ban this thing that's probably carcinogenic? And the business folks come and say, no, we can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is carcinogenic. So we have to just keep doing it because otherwise you're going to make us lose business. And that debate happens over and over in my committee. And it's I feel it deeply personal level because, if Alabama legislators in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s had taken a little bit more of a pro-human health and pro-environmental stance, maybe I wouldn't have had to go through, so many rounds of chemo, et cetera. So I have two bills basically on this subject. One is about well water. Private wells, especially on the Eastern Shore, have high concentrations of radon and nitrates, both which are bad. They give you cancer, blue baby syndrome, respiratory problems, the whole works. most private wells that have high levels of nitrates in particular are in communities of color along the Eastern Shore that are located in close proximity to these factory farms. Basically it runs off, gets in their private well water, but it's really expensive to test your well. And it's really, really expensive to remediate if you find a problem. So a lot of folks, even if they wanted to spend $100 to test their well, they're not going to be able to spend $10,000 to fix it. So why even test it? What's the point? Unless you're just going to stop drinking it, but this is your water source. So basically the bill sets up a well insurance program, not kind of like car insurance, where when you buy a home, you just pay a small fee, like 50, 60 bucks when you buy a home with a private well. That would go into a fund that then people with private wells could draw from to test their wells and to get them remediated. So simple fix, simple bill. I'm hopeful that'll pass, nothing super radical. My other bill, which I'm really excited about because I have breaking news on, is called the Safer Sealant Act. And it's a statewide ban on what are called driveway sealants, basically like lipstick for parking lots and driveways. There's a specific type of them. It's usually based in coal tar-based sealants that are carcinogens. Like they're terrible for the bay, they're terrible for waterways, and they absolutely give you cancer, especially if you're a child. So as a parent to a 2-year-old, this one hits especially close to home because one of the most common ways that these sealants get into people's body is when you track them in with your shoes and then they're ingested by toddlers, or they get on toys and then the toddlers put them in their mouth. And a bunch of kids have gotten cancer this way. So Montgomery County actually has already banned this, though this is actually a stronger ban. It's stronger in a lot of respects. But this would be a statewide ban. And this particular bill has been put in by some of my predecessors since 2012. So for a decade, 10 sessions. And we just got it through the subcommittee last night for the first time ever. It's never gotten this far. It's never gotten a favorable vote in a subcommittee. And it's on the calendar tomorrow for the vote in the full committee, and it'll pass, which means it's going to pass the full House within the next couple of weeks. And if we can get it through the Senate, we'll see, fingers crossed, Maryland could become the 5th state in the nation to ban these driveway sealants that are really hazardous. Yeah. So it's a big win. And I didn't think we were going to be able to pull it off, but it looks like we might be able to. So that's good. You win some, you lose some, but I lose enough where you got to really savor the wins. And then penultimately, immigration is a big thing. I actually have a really high profile bill called the Dignity Not Detention Act, which I'm co-sponsoring with, or cross-filing with. The Senate sponsor is Will Smith, who represents District 20 in Silver Spring and Tacoma Park, and he's actually the chairman of the Senate committee. So he's about as good of a cross-file as they say you can have. That bill would ban ICE detention centers from coming into Maryland, and it would phase out our existing 3 ICE detention centers. We have one in Howard County, one in Frederick County, and one on the shore. And all 3 of them house Montgomery County residents. All 3 of them house my constituents, our neighbors. And I'm sure a lot of y'all are aware of the deplorable conditions that are unfolding in these detention centers. I mean, it's absolutely criminal. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say these are glorified concentration camps or whatever. And that ICE really, I mean, some people say it's extreme to call it a terrorist organization, but I'm not really sure what else you would call ICE, because they not only are denying people medical care, strip searching people repeatedly with no cause, making people sleep on cold floors with lights on all the time. It's come out in Atlanta, they forcibly sterilized some of the female inmates. They forced hysterectomies on them. And these are I don't think that anyone should be treated this way, period. But these are not hardened criminals, right? These are not murderers they're doing this to. These are people who were picked up because they were passengers in a vehicle and they happen to be undocumented. And then they're shipped to a detention center and they're basically treated like this. We had a guy in my district who was picked up. He was helping his uncle trim trees, and DNR, the Department of Natural Resources, a state agency, pulled up and cited him for lacking a tree cutting license. He was not properly licensed to help cut his uncle's tree down. And before you know it, the DNR officer asked a couple questions, and within 30 minutes, my constituent was on a bus to the Frederick County ICE Detention Center, where he spent several months, being subjected to who knows what kind of treatment. Multiple people have died, multiple people have been beaten. Several women had been raped in these centers. So my view is that, basically Maryland just absolutely can no longer be complicit in ICE's depravity. Now, I'm hopeful that obviously things will get better during the Biden years, right, during the Biden administration. Though I know that some of the Trump appointees have made it difficult for Biden to change course on ICE. But we also can't rest on our laurels because we can't guarantee that a Democrat's going to be in the White House forever. And so if we just sit here and say, oh, well, things will get better under Biden, I guess we don't have to worry about this anymore, then, what happens when another member of the Trump family is elected, God forbid, in, 4 years, and then we've got ICE on steroids. So that bill, I'm hopeful it's going to pass. I really think it's going to. That would make us the third state in the country to ban ICE detention centers. So that would be a big, big victory. And then finally, I'll note, because I know that Barbara Levin was mentioned earlier, I don't see her on the call. She was helpful, and her committee was helpful within Leisure World on this issue about long-term care insurance. So this isn't so much of a all-encompassing progressive priority. It's a little bit of an under radar issue, but I know within Leisure World, it's a really important issue. So I just wanted to speak about it briefly. But, as I'm sure you all know, basically these insurance companies made math mistakes. They made actuarial errors in the 1980s and 1990s. They underestimated how long people would live. They underestimated how long people would hold long-term care insurance policies. And as a result, they've been having to make up for it by increasing premiums up to like the state cap of 15% every year, over and over and over, 15%, such that, families with these policies that got them, they thought they were doing everything right. They bought the policy in their 50s or 60s. That's what you're told to do. Don't wait too long. Otherwise they're too expensive. Buy in your sort of middle age years. They did that in the 90s or 2000s. And now the plans are so unaffordable, they doubled or tripled in annual cost for folks on fixed incomes. And so the bill we have is very modest. So then Delegate Kramer, now Senator Kramer, then Senator Mano, a bunch of people try to tackle this. The bills usually die. So I try to go with a super narrowly targeted bill, just like that. Like I thought it would be impossible for the industry to gripe about, which is that once you turn 85, no more premium increases. Which I thought, 85 plus population, it's not enormous, with these plans. But we had the hearing yesterday, and of course the insurance industry was claiming this was going to put them out of business. The really important point on this, actually, that I think a lot of folks don't understand is these are national businesses. So when we are basically let them walk all over us, when we're not tough with the insurance industry, our seniors in Maryland are subsidizing the seniors in other states that are tougher because these are national companies. If one state tells them to go screw off, then they're just going to raise premiums on seniors in another state. So by us kind of bending over backwards for them, we're just helping out the seniors in New York or Pennsylvania or California or whatever. And their cries that they're going to go out of business are just absolutely refuted by the fact that the executives of these companies make over $10 million a year. I mean, you'd think that they could maybe cut back on like one or two of their yachts or whatever so that seniors in Leisure World and elsewhere throughout the state don't have to pay an extra $700, $800 every year to make up for mistakes they made, math errors they made. So I just wanted to also mention that. I know that that's not as sort of a broad, sexy topic or whatever have you, but I know that that's important to a lot of folks in Leisure World. And then I guess one more, I know I said that was the last one, but the last one, I actually also have a hate crimes bill just because I know that this is a big topic with what happened on January 6th, right? I mean, we're living through really tumultuous times on so many levels because we not only have a global pandemic, we not only have a recognition of how Black and brown people have been historically treated in this country and the systemic racism of our country. Now we have this situation where we have the neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism and fascism supercharged. We have openly fascist members of Congress, and we have openly fascist people with fascist signs and anti-Semitic sweaters literally marching on the Capitol. And now people with the gall to say that they shouldn't be held accountable. The same people who say law and order, we should lock up, a Black 14-year-old for having 2 ounces of marijuana. Those same people are now saying, January 6th, they committed treason, but that was 2 weeks ago. Can't we just move on? And so I have a bill on hate crimes, and it's a restorative bill. It's a rehabilitative bill. I think, a lot of people's first impulses is after witnessing what happened on January 6th to hell with these people, throw the book at them, lock them up as much as long as we can. But what the research says is that for folks, especially when they're younger, there's a timeline of hate that builds. People are not born bigots. People are not born anti-Semites. They're not born to be racist. There's a timeline. They grow into that. It's learned behavior over years and years and years. And there's a lot of research from other states and from Europe that suggests if we can get them early, maybe after they've spray painted a swastika on a synagogue, right? But not after they've stabbed someone and uttered a racial slur, but early in the process, and put them through an anti-bias curriculum, a training program, then it actually works. It cuts the recidivism rate to virtually zero if you put them through one of these programs. So the bill I'm working on with a great senator named Shelley Heddleman from Baltimore County would basically require the University of Maryland system to create one of these anti-bias training curriculum, and it would allow judges to sentence people to that. Now, they wouldn't replace jail time. Judges would still retain discretion. So obviously, if someone did something heinous, we're not just going to say, oh, just go to the training program. You don't have to serve jail time. It could be in conjunction with jail time. It could replace jail time for more minor offenses. It would be up to the judge, but at least the curriculum would be there. It would exist. And all the data show, there's a San Diego program where 80 convictees, young convictees, were put through a similar program. And after some follow-up, 0 had reoffended. So, and normally the recidivism rate is like 60 or 70%. This is something people do over and over and over. They get a slap on the wrist. They start with the swastika. They step up and up and up, and then before too long they become murderers. And with Facebook and with Parler and with Twitter and with the president, there's so much to incite people to hate and to learn these behavior and to blame all their problems on people who don't look like them or worship like them or love like them or whatever. That I think the only way to attack the problem is at its root, and that goes to education. So that's the Educate Against Hate Act. It passed the Senate last year. We couldn't get through the House in time, but I'm hopeful that'll happen as well. So anyway, I didn't leave very much time. I rambled and I ranted for way longer than I wanted to, but I'll now open it up for questions, and I'm sorry I went so long.
That was a great presentation.
Yeah, we appreciate it. And we wish you all the luck in this session and hope you get most of that stuff passed. Let me just, hi, Roger. Roger's got a question, but let me ask you this first, Delegate Stewart. One of the issues that pops up a lot among this group and other groups is part of the police reform and accountability agenda around school first officers. And so I'm wondering, as you know, there's 2 competing bills in the Montgomery County Council. Delegate Acevedo and Delegate Wilkins have got bills on this. Wonder where you see that ending up. I know the Montgomery County principals would like to retain them. The police department would. So there's a pretty sizable divide on that issue. I wonder if you've got some comments.
Yeah. So yeah, great question. And I guess just to paint the picture of what's happening in general with policing, because I didn't explain it super well, the speaker convened a work group over the interim, and they issued recommendations. And their recommendations were actually way bolder and better than I thought they would be. And they actually include, for example, a full repeal of the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, LEOBR, which is a terrible bill that provides the police officers who have done something wrong. And it's just an absolute, and really the sad thing is it started in Maryland, and then all these other states copied this terrible bill. So to her credit, this and to the committee's credit, they recommended the repeal of that. A lot of people were shocked. That went from an idea that was a fringe idea that maybe only the most sort of pro-justice minded legislators 5 years ago would, dare to utter, to now being recommended by the Speaker of the House. A big, huge turnaround.
We need everybody to mute their mics if you're not talking, please.
But there are 2 things that were not in the Speaker's recommendations that are standalone bills that therefore it's not clear whether they're going to pass or not. One of them is Anton's Law, which is Delegate Acevedo's bill to provide more transparency in the Maryland Public Information Act about officers with a disciplinary history, basically, which I support and I've been a co-sponsor of for 2 years. The second bill is what Alan's asking about. That's not in the recommendation. So therefore, it's a standalone bill. The work group did not cover it, which means it's up for grabs. It's a jump ball, and that is Delegate Wilkins and Delegate Acevedo's bill called Counselors Not Cops, which would remove some state funding for the SRO programs. Now, counties could still do SROs, they just wouldn't get state funding for it. My position is that, while maybe some counties would disagree or whatever, I don't think that the state is in any position to be funding this. I think that the research about SROs is scant, that they have any positive impacts. I know that there are anecdotal stories about, individual officers who have had a positive impact on people, but writ large, I think that they do fuel the school to prison pipeline. I think that they do disproportionately discipline, arrest, suspend, aid in the discipline system that, all the studies say that folks get in trouble, students get in trouble at the same rates across race. There's no, I certainly, when I was in high school in Alabama, would get into fights and skip school and do all sorts of stuff and goof around. Everybody did. But all the data say that kids who look like me are way less likely to be punished, disciplined, imprisoned for that than kids who don't look like me. And I think that SROs play a vital link in that pernicious process. And so I'm a strong supporter of the bill. Now, in terms of its prospects, we don't know. We really don't. I think it's going to be a jump ball. If I had to guess, I would say it's more likely than not that it won't get through, just to be realistic. But a lot of it just depends on regular folks like y'all emailing legislators. Because unlike DC, where I feel like I'm not even sure, like I was an intern on the Hill, I'm not even sure most legislator and most members of Congress ever read their emails or answer the phone or anything, right? We do. We read everything. Like if y'all email me and say, hey, Vaughn, yada, yada, I see your email. Now, I may not be the one responding. Like Olivia, my chief of staff, may actually be writing the letter back, but I see all the emails. And so if you write like a heartfelt email to one of your legislators, they're going to see it. Now, obviously in District 19, we don't need to convince anyone. I'm pretty sure that Delegate Cullison, Delegate Crutchfield, and Senator Kramer are supporters of all this stuff already. But it does matter to reach out to folks. And I think that if people get engaged on this issue, then I think Delegate Wilkins and Delegate Acevero's bill will be successful. But if not, there are enough Democrats, I think, it's split, right? Like I think the Democratic Party is split on this issue. There are a lot of my colleagues who think that these SROs are maybe the only kind of positive male influence, for example, that a lot of students have, and that they play an overall positive role. I do not think the research bears that out. I understand that perspective. I disagree with it, but right now I think I'm not at all confident in making a prediction on the fate of the bill.
So people, we've got, if we go to 7, we've got 13 minutes left. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand.
I'll do rapid fire. I'll be much faster.
And quick, short questions and short answers. Where did you go? Roger, you go first, please.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. And thank you, Vaughn, for mentioning our brilliant legislative advocate, Barbara Levin, who wrote that letter for the Democratic Club. My question is on both COVID-19 vaccinations and on unemployment. We all talk about we don't want to increase, we want to really tackle social, economic, and racial inequities. On both those programs, we failed. The governor has rolled out 2 programs that make both those situations worse. What can the legislature do to grab this stuff out of the governor's mansion and take control of it? It's just horrible. And here in Leisure World, which is mobile, and it's just terrible.
I agree. Thanks, Roger, and thanks for all your work with the Democratic Club. I agree. Really, it's inexcusable. Maryland is the only state that has been consistently in the bottom 5 for both unemployment insurance and vaccines. So on the 2 big issues of our day that involve government competence, when you combine the 2, there's no state that has done worse than we have. And there's no governor who has done worse. So despite the fact that you'll see Governor Hogan on MSNBC and CNN pretending like he's this amazing problem solver, he has absolutely failed on these 2 things. And unfortunately, the legislature wasn't there for most of the UI issue, right? So, Olivia, my chief of staff, she was basically an additional employee of the Department of Labor because she was spending 95% of her time doing their work, trying to get people unemployment insurance. And I mean, I was grateful. Our office was actually written up by the Washington Post as one that was being especially helpful with UI claims, which I can't really take the credit for. It was all her. It was all Olivia. But so we were trying so hard, hours and hours throughout the spring, summer, and fall to make sure we could do all we could to help. But at the end of the day, we were relying on the Department of Labor to do their job, and they just weren't. So to answer your question about what we can do, well, the UI package that was announced today does the work on UI. It basically tells the governor he can no longer understaff this agency, and it can no longer be run by, it can continue have weak leadership. The person he appointed to the Department of Labor had never had any experience in a labor agency. She was basically like a campaign worker of his. And she had only been in the job like 6 months. And so I feel for her. She was inexperienced, but it's just been an abysmal failure. So the UI package that I mentioned, you can read about it. There's an article in the Washington Post that just came out 2 hours ago that details all the elements. I mentioned a few of them earlier. That I think will be really, really good for the UI system. Now the vaccine we're in the midst of, and fortunately the Senate launched an oversight committee of the vaccine rollout, and they are bringing the administration officials every week and grilling them about aspects of this. Like, why are you opening up to 1C before 1B has even been fully vaccinated, for example? Why are you giving all these vaccines to CVS and Walgreens, who have proven in other states that they're extremely slow and not efficient at getting it out the door? Why are you inequitably distributing the vaccines across counties, such that the more rural and smaller counties are getting way more per capita vaccines than Montgomery, Prince George's, and Baltimore City? On and on and on, grilling them on all these questions. And we have seen some movement on these issues, but unfortunately the legislature's role in the vaccine is going to be mostly oversight driven, which is effective. I think we can be effective in that role, but any legislation that we put in now, the governor could just veto, and he probably would. If we try to take more control over the vaccine process, he would veto these bills in June, and then we would have to come back next year to override the veto. Even if he let them go through, any legislation go through, it probably wouldn't come into effect until October 1, until hopefully the vaccine rollout will be mostly over. So unfortunately, because of the way these sessions work and the sort of balance of powers between the governor and the legislature, there's not a whole lot we can do legislatively on the vaccine. The best thing we can do is just to hammer him, just to bully him into being reasonably competent. I mean, I would take average at this point. If we were 25th in vaccine rollout, I would dance a jig. But we're consistently in the 40s. If you look at the tracker on the New York Times, whatever website you use, we're consistently in the 40s, oftentimes in the back half of the 40s at vaccine distribution. And it's so frustrating.
Hank has got a question.
Yes, Delegate Stewart, I, like everyone else, gets to see these commercials about the governor. I guess he's running for something soon. And his situation is that he wants to stop some sort of tax situations, tax bill. And it seems rather small, but it seems to be a way in which he can try to divide and conquer like usual. What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the legislature at the end of last session passed a digital advertising tax. So basically, if you put out an ad in a newspaper, you got to pay a tax on that ad. If I advertise in Leisure World News, I think I still have to pay a tax. But if you advertise on Facebook, then Facebook doesn't have to pay anything. Or if Facebook advertises on its own site or somewhere else, it doesn't have to pay anything. So it basically is like a digital advertising tax. It's one of the first that's ever been passed. It would generate a lot of revenue. And it would hit these big, these big kind of Silicon Valley corporation where it hurts. And so understandably, they've banded together, all these, big tech companies, created a PAC. They've roped Governor Hogan in, and they've tried to do this big ad blitz, trying to, propagandize and make this seem like it's a tax on regular people, or it's going to be passed down, all this nonsense. But this is Governor Hogan's playbook. He plays the demagogue on tax issues. It's going to have absolutely no effect. A lot of rich people are going to waste a lot of money on these ads, which I find hilarious, but we're still going to override the veto. It's going to have no effect.
Excellent. Thank you.
Question from Rosie.
Our whole purpose was to find out what we could help you with? Can you please tell us what is your priority? What could we help you with?
Yeah.
Letter writing, calling, whatever. What?
Absolutely. Well, so this is such a crazy session. Normally by this time during the session, I would have had 1 or 2 bill hearings, but because it's so front loaded because of the virus, because the virtual nature of the session, I've already had 10 of my 16 bill hearings already in early February. I normally would have had, 1 or 2 of 16. So a lot of my stuff is in the rearview mirror, but in terms of the hearing. But I think what I would say is I went through most of the bills that I'm working on. If any of that stuff strikes your fancy, just email me about, either specifically name a bill if you remember one that I mentioned, or just if a general concept is interesting to you, like, oh, I want to help with your environmental bills, just email me. I'll put my email in the chat and we'll let you know based on the bill, the sort of bill's timeline where you can best help. Because it could be there's still time to submit written testimony ahead of the bill hearing or to testify orally. It could be that, well, we've already had the House hearing, but it looks like it's going to pass the House and head over to the Senate. So there's an opportunity for that. So, there will be, a variety of different opportunities depending on kind of the life cycle of the bill. It looks like Barbara is raising her hand.
Barbara?
No, I wasn't, but I do have a question if it's the right time. Vaughn, the program you were talking about for people that committed crimes that made them understand race relations better, do they have something like that at the high school level?
There actually are there are some education, some high school based curricula, but they're optional. It's a good point. There was actually an effort like a couple of years ago to mandate Holocaust education in the high schools, which is, somewhat related. And that actually did happen after a lot of years of trying. But this anti-bias curriculum is not taught mandated in the high schools. But I understand that some high schools on an individual level, sometimes if kids demonstrate kind of, hate bias incidents in the school, but they're not arrested for it, then they will try to connect them with a program. But it's very ad hoc, and it kind of depends on if the principal is going to be entrepreneurial or whatever. So the answer is no, but it's something that I want to pursue in the future.
I think it's a good idea.
You've got a question, go ahead.
Yes, one, I want to thank Rosie and Sandy for inviting me to join you today. I want to thank Vaughn, Delegate Stewart.
Vaughn is okay.
For,
I said Vaughn.
for being such a good representative and keeping his district informed and up to date. And in answer to Rosie's thing of what we can do, I believe because of the way the legislature is working now, that if there's a bill that we want to support, even if it's had a hearing, I think it would not be a bad idea to write letters to the committee members in support of that bill before it gets voted on in committee. So that is a way we could help him.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Thank you. And thank you, Barbara, for all of your work and your help on our long-term care insurance bill. We appreciate all of your hard work just generally with the Democratic Club on getting,
Roger, leader.
And Roger, and I thank Roger, but both of you for all of your work trying to engage in the political process. But emails are great too. I know you're absolutely right. I mean, email is the currency of the session. There's no one's going to be rubbing elbows, but people are on top of their emails all the time. So, these bills take a long way to get through the process. They may have a bill hearing this week, but they may not go to subcommittee until a week, maybe 2 weeks after. And then it may get the full committee vote may not be another week after that. So there's a long winding journey. And so depending on which bill, it's going to be at a different stage of the process. But if you want to just email me what bill you like, I'll say, here are a couple of talking points. Here's who you could send an email to, or, submit testimony if there's still time. And that would be awesome. I would be very, very appreciative. I think the good thing about this virtual session is I think it's provided new opportunities for people to be involved because, you can testify orally, virtually. I think email is a lot more important. So for people that if it's hard for them to go down to Annapolis for a variety of reasons, work, disabilities, transport, whatever, this is really kind of the most open, open session we've ever had.
Let's take one more question. Christian, you had a question? You're muted. You have to unmute your phone. You have to unmute. And while he is unmuting, for the rest of the people in the group, let's try to plan our next meeting by email. Since I don't know that we'll have time to talk about it here. I can't unmute you. You're going to have to unmute yourself. You could use sign language.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay, this question is a bit off track, but if you can tell me, where are we in relation to fracking in the state?
We banned it. We banned it 3 years ago.
Great, thank you.
Good note to end on is that we banned fracking 3 years ago. On behalf of everybody in Progressive Legacy, Vaughn, I want to thank you for joining us in this virtual session. We hope that we're going to do many more of these since nobody has to drive and we can be safe and warm in our homes. So we hope to be doing more of this with your colleagues on the county council. So thank you so much. And we wish you the best during the rest of the session. Hank, do you want to say something as we sign off? You're muted. If you are muted.
Yes, goodbye, and thank you very much, Mr. Stewart, for kicking off this year's meetings. You've set us in the right direction.
Absolutely.
Thank you
Bill
all.
Princeton here, one of the best sessions that I've ever attended.
Yeah,
Oh,
thank
wow.
you.
Wonderful.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much,
That's
Vaughn.
great. It
Thank
was.
everybody
It's
for
been great.
joining. We
I'll
have,
just say,
we
I really
have,
appreciate y'all's time, and I hope everyone. I really appreciate the invite, and I hope y'all will get engaged because I think this is.
Oh, we
this
definitely
go down
will.
as I think,
Yeah, we will.
think this will go down as maybe the most important session in the legislature's history because of all the different needs we have to tackle, and it really starts with y'all getting involved and making sure that my colleagues hear from you. So I really appreciate the opportunity to chat. It's always great to see all of your faces. I haven't seen some of you in months and months, so it's awesome. I appreciate the invite.
we have made a recording of this and that'll be made available over the course of the next few hours. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Alan. You did a great job like
It
usual.
was super. Great
No
meeting.
doubt about it.